The fact that we are once again debating an emergency piece of COVID legislation underlines the impact that this pandemic is having upon the Irish public. We're all aware of the impact it's had economically, and I think we're all aware also of the impact it's had on the physical health of the people of Ireland. However, an area of life that isn't given sufficient attention is the impact that the pandemic is having on the mental health and indeed the spirit of the people of Ireland. And I'm very concerned about the ongoing impact the pandemic and the necessary restrictions that come with it are having upon the Irish public. I've met people who never before have suffered from depression, and they are now depressed as a result of the pandemic and the fact that they don't see any hope or they don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. I think it is important that we, as legislators, as people who keep a close eye on the development of this pandemic, that we let the Irish public know that there are reasons to be hopeful and that there is light at the end of this terrible tunnel. And if I could just mention some of the reasons why we should be hopeful, Cathaoirleach, because I don't think they're being given sufficient attention in the media or indeed by us as politicians. For instance, the first measurement of any pandemic is you look to see its mortality. How many people have died as a result of this pandemic? The first person in Ireland recorded as having died with or of COVID was back in March. And in the 2 months after that first person died, or was recorded as having died, a further 1,487 deaths were recorded of or with COVID. That was a huge number of deaths in that 2-month period. But let's look at the 2 months which have just gone. Let's talk about July and August. They're particularly important months because they were months when the restrictions were lifted and people were back trying to get some semblance of normality. During that period of 2 months, there were only 40 recorded deaths of people dying of or with COVID. And it's important to note, as is the case with the death that was recorded today, that many of those 40 deaths related to deaths which took place prior to the 2-month period I'm talking about. Now, each one of those deaths, whether it's the 1,487 deaths in the first 2-month period, were a trauma for the family members of those who died. And the 40 deaths in the past 2 months similarly are a trauma. But when it comes to assessing and appraising a pandemic, we have to look at the mortality figures, and those figures give us hope that we're over the worst part of the mortality of this pandemic. Let's also look at another measurement by which you can assess a pandemic, and that is hospitalizations. Back in April, at the height of the impact of the pandemic on this country, there were 881 people in hospital with COVID. And of those 881, there was at one stage 155 in intensive care. So they were the highest figures on a particular date in April. Very significant figures, and there were figures which nearly threatened the capacity of our health system. But when you look at the figures today, you can see that there are 40 people in hospital. We wish them all well and hope they have a speedy recovery. Of those 40, only 6 of them are in intensive care. So again, when you measure hospitalizations, there is reasons to be hopeful because of the reduction in the number of people in hospital with COVID at present. Now, there has been an increase, a slight increase in the number of people in hospital over the past 2 weeks or so, but that is to be expected because of the fact that we have lifted restrictions. And there's much greater amount of testing ongoing in Ireland at present. That's very fortunate as well. But let us not become unnecessarily unnerved by the rise in the number of figures. The issue we need to keep a close eye on is the number of people in hospital. Unfortunately, those numbers have reduced significantly. I also think it would be beneficial if NPHET and the Health Service gave us statistics about the number of recoveries. We know that to date there are around 29,000 cases, positive cases of COVID in Ireland, but we should be informed of the number of people who have fully recovered. Obviously, this is a very dangerous and nasty disease, particularly for elderly people and people with underlying conditions. But we need to be informed of the extent to which the majority of people who have got this disease or have been tested positive have recovered from it. So that's another reason why I think there is some hope there when you look to see at the recoveries that are there but which need to be publicised more. Finally, I think the best bit of news that this country has had in the past 6 months occurred in the past 6-7 days. We have got hundreds of thousands of children back to school. I'm sure you've seen it, Cathaoirleach, the joy in children's faces as they're going back into the classroom, the joy in their parents' faces as they see their children going back to school. And I want to commend the children and their parents for that. But more especially, I want to commend the teachers of Ireland and the principals who have done a huge amount of work to ensure that the schools are ready and safe for children. And the teachers of Ireland, I think, have excelled themselves during the lockdown as well as now, and they will continue to do so because they are committed selflessly to the education of young people in Ireland. I think we all appreciate the absolute importance of providing education to young people in Ireland. I spoke previously in the Dáil back in April and May about the impact this pandemic was having on the educational development of young people. It had a very regressive and negative impact on young people. I think we should ensure that never again do we close down our schools because we regard it as a measure to deal with COVID-19. It has too many negative repercussions for our children. In terms of the legislation that is before the House, Cathaoirleach, I support it. I think it is important that if the Gardaí are being asked to regulate premises, that they have the powers to do something practical if those regulations aren't being obeyed. I agree with people who have spoken here. The vast majority of public houses that are open now are behaving very responsibly. I was down in Kerry during August. The pubs down there that are open and the restaurants, many of them are working together. And people are being very responsible, the people who are running the businesses. And I also think we have to emphasise that the people of Ireland are being very responsible. They are behaving like adults. And I think when we treat them like adults, they respond responsibly in respect of what their obligations are. I mentioned about 2 weeks ago, Cathaoirleach, that I think it is very important that we as policymakers inform the people of Ireland what is our aim and objective at present in dealing with this pandemic. There was a political consensus back in March and April. We saw the terrible scenes in the hospitals in northern Italy and Spain. We saw the terrible scenes where people in those hospitals could not get the medical treatment they required in the intensive care units. Because of that, we decided we were not going to let that happen in this country. Because of that, we decided we were going to close down our economy. We took over the private hospitals. We established a field hospital out in City West. All of those measures were introduced by us with the agreement of everyone in this House because we did not want to contemplate a circumstance where any person would come into a hospital in Ireland and not be able to get the appropriate medical treatment. As I say, we were right to do it because in early April there was 881 people in hospital on a particular day, 155 of them on another day were in intensive care. So that objective worked and the people understood why we were closing down our economy to ensure that didn't happen. Now, as I say, with the numbers dropping, with there only being 40 people in hospital today and hopefully the numbers in hospital staying low, we need to inform the public what's the aim and objective of this state. And as I see it, there are 3 objectives we could seek to achieve when it comes to our response to COVID-19 in its current phase. First, we could go for the option that has been recommended by very many eminent immunologists and scientists, and that is that we seek to have a COVID-0 island. I don't think that's attainable, and I say that with the greatest respect to the immunologists and the scientists who've advocated it. Even if we had sought to do it much earlier on, and had we got to a situation as in New Zealand where there were no recorded cases for a while, I think it would have been impossible for Ireland to retain that because of our land border with the United Kingdom and because of our membership of the European Union. We also need to recognise if we wanted a COVID-0 island, we'd have to shut down for probably another 4 or 5 weeks fully and then wait for 2 more weeks with no recorded cases. So I don't think that's attainable. The second option is that we decide that we're going to restrict human interaction considerably until such time as we discover a vaccine. I also think that would have devastating consequences. It would mean probably that in terms of education, we'd have to go back to remote teaching of our children. That is not something that is acceptable to the people of Ireland. It would also mean that the very many young people in their 20s who have ambitions and aspirations, they would be required to put those ambitions and aspirations on hold until such time as we get a vaccine. And I hope there will be a vaccine, as does everyone in this House, but there's no guarantee that there will be a vaccine. Even if there is a vaccine, we know from other vaccines available that that doesn't mean that COVID-19 is going to be eliminated. So I don't think that's an option. And the third option, I think it's the most feasible option, is that we have to recognise and accept that people in Ireland are going to contract COVID-19, but that we do our best by applying public health measures to ensure that we keep those figures as low as possible. And I think, although we haven't stated it, that's the strategy that we are on at present. I do not think we're going to be able to get to a situation where we will consistently have no COVID cases in Ireland. But what we can do is we can ensure that we continue with the hygiene measures, that if we have any symptoms, we stay at home and stay away from people, and that we keep our distance. But I do think if we do that, we need to ensure that we can open up our society. We're never going to get back to the situation as existed before, where you could have nightclubs or pubs where people are congregated densely on top of each other. That's not going to happen. But what we can do, and I hope to see this, is that we will be able to open all public houses. And people will be responsible, and publicans will be responsible. And they will know that they can't have densely congregated groups in their public houses. It may be that we'll just have to give indicators to publicans that you can only have a certain number of people in a pub dependent upon your square footage. And people are adults and people will comply with that. But what I don't want to see happening is that we become very judgmental about young people. I sense a bit of that seeping into the debate that's taking place in this country. You know, this is a huge issue for young people. Very many of their ambitions have been put on hold, and people in their 20s, you expect them to be enjoying themselves. The vast majority of them have been extremely responsible, and I think they will continue to be extremely responsible. But really what we need to do, if we're going to go down the route that I recommend, is that we're going to have to be very careful in protecting vulnerable groups. We're going to have to be extremely careful in protecting the elderly. It may mean that visits to nursing homes will be extremely closely regulated, and only certain visits will be permitted. It's going to be the case that people with underlying conditions are going to have to be very much protected by the state. The state has a huge duty to them. When we look back at the history of this COVID-19 pandemic in Ireland, I think the great state failing will be what happened in our nursing homes in February, March and April of this year. That was the real trauma that took place in this country. And we have to ensure that in the future we protect vulnerable groups, the elderly and those with underlying conditions. But can I conclude, Cathaoirleach, by saying there are reasons to be hopeful, and we can't let a situation develop where the people of Ireland every evening just wait till 6:30 to see what are the numbers today, and then they pessimistically and anxiously go off, not knowing what's going to happen to their lives.